where you're kind of coming from into the Overwatch scene for those who may not know you?
I'm ioStux. I am 20 years old and I come from Germany. I initially started making educational content, and then eventually I turned that into, doing guides and videos and stuff like that. Slowly transitioning into private coaching, and then eventually coaching teams. And recently, the best team that I've coached was XL2 Academy, which was the Contenders team of New York.
Excellent. And hi to everybody who can see us now.
Yes.
Okay, who wants to go first? One of you guys ask a question.
I can go ahead and ask one. Kind of just jumping right in, we've seen a lot of these kind of contenders changes lately. They've been big in the news, officially reported today about the restructuring of contenders for 2019. I just kind of wanted to get your initial thoughts on this. I know you're in the process of developing these thoughts and what have you, but I just kind of wanted to get your initial feedback on what your take is on the changes made, if you had any suggestions moving forward.
I think the changes are not as bad as the initial leaks made them out to be. Although, again, I'm not truly convinced that, we know the full story yet. Potentially they're hesitating with, kind of rolling out all of the changes. And it is still very early. I mean, the third season of this year's Contenders hasn't even started yet. So there's still, a lot of room for changes to be made. That said, I think that there are some good parts to the changes, and I think I understand what Blizzard is trying to accomplish with this. I'm just a little sad because the feeling that I get is that this initial idea of having a clearly defined path to pro, as they called it, is, they're kind of starting to give up on that, and they're trying to focus more on incentivizing Overwatch League franchises into investing into contenders and bringing up academy teams, rather than focusing on, attracting endemic orgs into the scene and letting talent and the entire scene develop a little bit more naturally.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. What do you think the implications of this are on collegiate Overwatch? I think this is something that I think is going to end up playing into this. What do you kind of think is going to happen on the collegiate scene based on this?
I genuinely believe that anyone that has the opportunity to go into collegiate Overwatch right now should 100% do that. I cannot recommend staying in contenders if you do have a collegiate offer for any reason besides, passion and wanting to make it into the Overwatch League. So I think it's, in the long term, going to be wiser. Obviously, having that education is going to be really good. You're still able to play competitively, and the reality is that most collegiate teams are vastly inferior to the teams that participate in contenders and contenders trials. So all of the players that are now, that have been in trials and that have been in the lower ends of contenders as unsigned entities, they are going to have I think an easy time transitioning into collegiate, since the competition there is a lot less stiff, mainly because, if you're in collegiate, you're doing more than just playing the game. You have to focus on your studies as well, which I think kind of factors into the lower level of skill in the collegiate.
And building off of that, in a quote that you gave .esports earlier, you said that it seems like Contenders is being rebuilt, which could be good in the long run, but it is destructive for all the longtime players in the scene. Could you elaborate a little bit on why you think that's the case?
So most of the players that I've talked to, they usually, whenever they start pursuing a professional career in esports, they take a break year after finishing high school, or they set aside some money for a year or so, and they say, okay, I'm gonna try doing this for a year, and if it doesn't work out after the year, I'm out. And a lot of the players that have been in the scene for a very, very long time, I think Ajax from Last Night's Leftovers is probably one of the best examples as a player that has been in the scene very, very long. Eventually it becomes financially irresponsible and, quite frankly, unfeasible to continue pursuing the path to pro if it doesn't bring any financial security with it. And the longer someone has been in the scene, the more difficult it becomes to justify spending any more time into the scene. Because I remember that a year ago, everyone has been thinking about, it's worth it to keep going. It's gonna get better, and they're gonna walk the path to pro and make this sustainable. And now it's been 1 year later and things haven't really changed. So telling themselves, I'm gonna put in another year and hope that I get picked up by an academy team. Maybe it can work out, but I feel like for a lot of those long-term players, that risk isn't worth taking. Whereas for newer players who haven't invested as much into the scene, they can probably get away with, saying, okay, I'm going to put in a year, see how it goes. They're kind of the newcomers. And for me personally, at this point, if it weren't for my involvement with academy teams and the private coaching that I do on the side, I would probably be forced to quit as well, just because I've been doing this for 2 years now. And if there was no financial stability in what I'm doing, this would be, it just wouldn't be responsible for me to do it any longer. So I'm actually quite surprised that a lot of the players that are still in the scene are planning to stay in the scene.
Do you think that in, for instance, season 1 or season 2 of 2019, whenever the time frame may be, if more Overwatch League teams develop academy teams, or at least in North America, because there aren't too many to develop outside of that except China, pretty much. Do you think an increased number of academy teams will kind of help fix the problems we're initially seeing right now, where those teams can invest in the path to pro, sign some unsigned players from open division or trials or what have you as their roster and start supporting those guys? Or do there need to be like the unsigned organizations to kind of make the scene go?
No, if anything, having more academy teams does make the path to pro in of itself more financially sustainable for players. And I think that the total amount of salary, players in the following seasons is going to increase. The problem that I have with this isn't that it's bad for, the tier 2 scene in North America. I think the main critiques of it are how this affects other regions that do not have any academy teams. And also it kind of defeats the purpose of the path to pro, because the initial idea and the way that Blizzard described the path to pro was that any player could just start an open division, and if he would, theoretically speaking, just win over and over and over again, he would eventually become pro. But now, just winning a whole lot, it can get you into contenders, but contenders alone isn't sustainable, especially now that the prize pool is a little bit more top heavy. That makes it even more difficult for the bottom teams to really stay there. So at that point, they can win. It doesn't really matter because they're still, at the mercy of the scouts and the managers behind academy teams. And, a lot of different things like cronyism or favoritism, all of that sort of stuff might stop them from making it into an academy, position. And that's kind of what we wanted to avoid. That's what they wanted to avoid with the path to pro, where, you don't have to play politics in order to go pro. All you have to do is just become the best that you can be. And I think they're giving up on that idea, and they're saying, okay, we're giving academy teams kind of control of, who can make Overwatch Tier 2 a sustainable profession and who cannot.
Was it you who coined the term Overwatch League Light? I know that's
yeah.
been thrown around a little bit.
Yeah.
No, that's kind of what I've been getting from it as well, that they're trying to establish like a miniature version, which at the top is maybe sustainable, but like you said, for teams floating around a bit below that who are maybe on the edge, it gets a little more difficult. Sorry, go ahead. Anybody else?
So as the head coach for an academy team, what is the greatest advantage that academy teams have over, say, a contenders team that's gone through contenders trials and like your last night leftovers, for example? What are the biggest differences and benefits academy teams gain?
I think one of the biggest differences is actually one that a lot of academy teams aren't actively abusing, and that's the connection that they have with their Overwatch League equivalent. So XL2 was a team that was very active with the New York Excelsior, and practicing with New York Excelsior had two advantages. For one, the competition was much steeper, and the more challenging the practice is, the more you get out of it usually. And also it allowed us to practice more consistently. Sometimes other teams might struggle with finding scrims. We could always just book with our own team. And lastly, we didn't have to worry about, sharing strats with too many teams. We can always, treat these scrim blocks with our all equivalent as kind of, testing grounds without really disclosing that information to other teams. Other than that, the obvious things are, having a team house, having a salary, And not just from a financial standpoint, all of these things also help mentally a lot. The path to pro and the tier 2 scene can be very, very straining, because if someone doesn't know whether they're going to be able to pay their rent this month, that's going to affect them a lot, and that's going to directly impact their performance. Whereas players on academy teams, they usually don't have to worry about those things. They don't have to worry about getting a second job or have to worry about whether they're going to have to give all of this up. They can just focus on pure practice, and that kind of gives them an edge mentally over unsigned players.
Interesting. So I have just one kind of baseline question about Overwatch, because we talked about this a little bit in our. Kind of want to expand on it for those in the chat that may not be super familiar with Overwatch coaching. Kind of walk us through. So as head coach of XL2 Academy, what is kind of your main role as head coach? This is a really pretty basic question, but at that level, is it spent VOD reviewing? What percentage of the time? Is it spent imparting previous strategies that you're already aware of? Just kind of walk us through what that process is like being a head coach.
To clarify, I wasn't technically the head coach for XL2. Me and Kita were officially co-coaching. Okay. There's a long, kind of annoying story behind it that I don't want to get into. But anyways, I guess the main job of the head coach is to be the person that has the last say and to be the person that makes the final decisions. So that can stretch from choosing what compositions you want to run on each map and kind of bringing up arguments as to why that is, explaining how certain compositions are supposed to be played. If players are arguing about play styles, you can just tell them, okay, your arguments are fine, but I think this is better for the team overall. And I think it is just a pure leadership role in the end. The coach, it doesn't, or the head coach position, contrary to popular belief, isn't actually, the main position that comes up with all of the, super, super secret strategies and that makes all of the big brain moves. What a head coach is all about, from my experience, is being that leadership figure to the team and knowing how to properly manage and offload certain tasks to the rest of the supports. So yeah, he's kind of the, I'm trying to be the connecting piece between all of the players and all of the other staff.
Makes sense.
Got it. If you don't mind, I've got a question about, you talked about the hidden advantage, I guess, or the one that isn't really acknowledged of academy teams being able to scrim with their Overwatch League franchise, their resident Overwatch League franchise, and to prevent like more VODs and strategies getting out into the common access of other teams and stuff. That was brought up a lot in something that I've been covering, which of course is Contenders Trials. Most of North America was not broadcast at all with that justification in mind, that they didn't want to leak strategies before they really had to. Do you think that, obviously, is that like a valid move? Do you think that maybe they should have tried to broadcast that in the interest of the tier 3 scene? Or like, was it way better for them to just like keep it all under wraps?
This is potentially going to come off as a little arrogant and maybe elitist, but the majority of teams in trials do not have any sort of structure or strategies or even the ability to really get a lot of value out of leaked VODs. It's kind of like, okay, we know what you're going to run, but they won't be able to use that information in order to make, actually make sound decisions that are going to increase their win rate. So I think the idea of, I don't want to stream it because I think that other teams are going to get an advantage because of it in Contenders Trials is a little overrated in my eyes. And to be honest, even at an academy level, I don't think that, a VOD getting leaked once or twice is really going to, affect the outcome of most matches that much. Most teams should be able to just adapt on the fly. And if a team cannot do that, then I don't think they should really be, considered for the higher tiers of contenders in the first place. I think that's a very fundamental skill that they just need to have. And again, I know that this is probably going to sound like very condescending on most of the trials teams, but trials really, I think one of the, if we look at Open Division, for example, Shoes Money Crew was a team that hasn't scrimmed at all. They didn't really have any strategies. They just did what they wanted. And even they managed to make it into Contenders Trials in the end. And that kind of shows that strategy is less of a factor in trials than it is in higher levels of competition. And what it really is about is synergy and individual player skill, tracking, mechanics, decision making, all of those things. And those things cannot be leaked.
Kind of on the flip side of that, while academy teams can scrim their Overwatch League franchise to keep things from leaking, whether or not that's valid or anything, the Overwatch League team could also, like NYXL could also say, we want to scrim XL2, so Seoul Dynasty doesn't get a hold of our strats. Would you feel at that level that that's like, okay, yeah?
Yes. At that level, definitely. I think Seagull once gave a very good example of this, of a match that he played against NYXL. I think it was NYXL on King's Row.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Where Jonak was playing differently because he recognized Seagull's play pattern on that match. And at that level of competition, leaking VODs is devastating to the team that's the victim of said VODs. And it is very, very, very common for not just in NYXL, but also amongst other AL teams, for them to scrim their academy teams in order to test out strategies. And even on earlier teams, when I used to be on bye week, which is arguably one of the worst contenders teams that has ever existed, unfortunately, even we ended up getting scrims against one of the, I don't think I can say which team it was, but we got scrims against one of the best teams in the entirety of the Overwatch League, just to warm them up for their Overwatch League match, because they did not want to, end up showing their strategies off to anyone else.
Do you think Overwatch League teams would benefit from having, are you of the opinion, I guess, that Overwatch League teams would benefit from having 12 players so they can run internals, or is it enough for them to go through with like contenders?
I think Overwatch is a little bit too young for most teams to really get full value out of a full 12-man roster. And I think for now, having an OWL team and an academy team is kind of the best thing that we can get. That said, in the future, when the overall level of play and strategy increases, I do think having a full 12-man roster is going to be worth it. Not just because you have another 6-man roster in your team that you can scrim internally, but also because in the end, players that specialize are going to be favored over players that are kind of of all trades, masters of none. So having a dedicated Reinhardt specialist, having a dedicated Winston specialist, for example. We've always had that dynamic in XL2 where Clone Man was more of the Reinhardt player and Tizzy was more of the Winston player. And that, I think, during the regular season especially, gave us a huge advantage because it minimized the amount of maps that each of those players had to learn and practice on. And as such, if they were forced to play on a map that they didn't practice for, they would obviously underperform. But the few maps that they could really, really focus on, those were the maps where they excelled.
Gotcha. I think one thing I'm interested about, so, when you talk about having these Overwatch League teams as the level of play increases in the next few years, and then they have their academy teams as well, do you think when the scrimmages become more internal, that's going to raise the strategy level of contenders as well? Is that kind of the ideal with that? Or what do you think that interaction is going to be as the level of play increases in Overwatch League with contenders based on that internal scrimmaging model?
Lower tiers are always going to improve if the higher tiers above them improve. Most of the players in contenders do see the value behind studying Overwatch League VODs and figuring out how they play the game. So as the Overwatch League improves, the contenders league will always be able to catch up to that, I guess, relative constant distance between the level of skill at Overwatch League and the academy teams.
As we look at all of the changes coming to contenders, something that's been a highlight for me, at least, was the soft region locking, where there will be a maximum of 3 non-resident players on their roster. So if you are in a NA Academy team, only 3 can be non.
Oh no, she cut out.
Oh,
I think she died. I think I get the question though.
She's been doing so well.
You get the question after.
Yeah, I got the question. I can just answer the question while she figures it out.
That's fine.
So overall, in North America, the region locking isn't going to really affect that much. Most teams right now don't break the rule in the first place. Where this rule becomes more effective is for the regions like, Pacific contenders, where a lot of the Korean teams are kind of evading because there aren't that many Korean contender slots. And I think this is one of the main critiques of these contenders changes, is that Korea was already a very oversaturated region because the way that the whole esports structure kind of flourishes, the amount of talent that emerges is very, very high. And 12 contender slots was already very, very low. Contenders could have its own league and fill it with very talented teams that can compete against each other. So reducing that number from 12 to 8 and also adding region locking is going to add an incredible amount of Korean players that have what it takes and that can play at an extremely high level, but that won't be able to compete at all. And I think that's, if you look at it, at kind of a pragmatic way, for North American player, that's going to be good, I guess, because the players that could be competition for them, the players that could be better for them, don't even get the chance to show off their skills. But if you look at it from the Korean player's perspective, this is, I think, very, very harmful. So I'm not sure what, I guess, the long-term plan for that is going to be, but it really feels like this change is mostly aimed at kind of the Asian scene and Koreans especially, who have been moving out of Korean contenders into other regions so that they could have a platform to kind of compete against other teams and show off their skills.
How would you, after going through the official announcement, because I know there were some like fakes and leaks and weird stuff, and knowing that we maybe haven't seen the whole thing, just with what we've got right now, what would you like tweak or change to make these changes a little more palatable to regions that aren't North America, at least, that seem to be affected a little more harshly, like expanding in Korea, for example, and things like that?
I think in the end, the main bottleneck is always going to be financial. And it doesn't matter what direction you want to take contenders in. So the first direction you can take contenders in is to focus on third-party tournaments and endemic organizations, but with the current sponsorship limitations. Blizzard has mentioned that they are welcoming third-party organizers to create their own tournaments, and they're saying that the prize pools for them with a proper license is unlimited, and that is correct. But that doesn't really capture the fact that they're not properly incentivizing third-party organizers to really join because of these strict sponsorship limitations. So that direction is kind of off already. That would be a nice source of extra cash flow, because if third-party tournament organizers, they could get extra sponsors, they could raise the prize pools, they could have very regular tournaments. If we think back about the monthly meetings, for example, that was always a nice regular piece of a little bit of money on the side, financial stability, and also mostly a lot of exposure for the players. A lot of the top players in Overwatch League right now became famous because of those monthly tournaments. But yeah, that direction isn't going to happen from the way it looks right now. Blizzard is focusing on being in control of the tier 2 scene, and they don't really want any third-party organizers to really take over, I guess. So the other direction would be to for Blizzard themselves to invest into contenders, to create more slots, to increase the prize pools, to improve the production, to put more money into marketing and advertising and structuring it all so that it doesn't interfere too much with the Overwatch League. And that was what I initially expected. And I'm not sure if they're going to do it. Maybe they will. But I really expected them to maybe talk a bit more about how they're going to promote contenders and how they're going to incentivize people to watch contenders. Because if viewership numbers would increase, and even something as small as increasing the stream quality, I think would have a noticeable impact on the viewership numbers. Because right now the stream quality is a little, it makes watching Overwatch very difficult. So yeah, overall, third-party organizers, they're not a valid source of extra income or extra financial support for the tier 2 scene because of the sponsorship limitations. And Blizzard themselves, according to these changes, they do not want to invest into it either. So that leaves us with step 3, and that's, I think, what's going to happen. They want the academy teams to be the main source of support, or the OWL franchises to be the main investors behind the tier 2 scene. And New York Excelsior, I think, is the best example there. They are very, very, I guess, engaged about the local New York scene. And so they want to create tournaments there. And all of the other Overwatch League teams, they probably also want to run local tournaments and involve their academy teams in some way. The problem is that right now there just aren't enough franchises, especially if you look outside of NA, that there's, again, probably not enough money really in it right now. So that's what I mean by these changes being very, very long-term, because if there are enough old franchises and enough, or, I guess, events organized by these old franchises that tier 2 players could participate in, then it could become sustainable. But right now, that's, we're not that far yet, unfortunately.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, it was a really good answer.
So as we do move forward, as we look to the more immediate future of contenders, I'm kind of curious what your immediate future is starting to look like as we do go closer and closer to the next season. Do you have any goals or opportunities or anything you would like to share coming up?
That you're allowed to tell us.
Yeah, of course. I am going to try my best to, moving forward, take that head coach position. So as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't the official head coach of XL2 because of some internal things. So I guess that's what I can tell you. I am actively looking for, an official head coach position and being, taking charge of a team, at a level as high as I can go, pretty much. But that said, a lot of other coaches that have been head coaches, they're, and as expected, they're going to have an easier time getting coaching opportunities, because, if you look at it from a resume perspective, being able to say that you head coached the last season of Contenders, that kind of qualifies you a little bit more than saying that you co-coached the last season of Contenders. And it's also a little bit more difficult, I guess, for people to see how much of that success was actually, I guess, my part, and how much part of that success was from my co-coach. Whereas, with a head coach, okay, if the team did well, he's the guy that made the final decisions. He's the one that, I guess we can rely on. Yeah, that's all I can really give you right now. I'm gonna try my best to get a head coaching position.
Yeah, totally good. I kind of wanted to ask about the future. We're talking about the future right now. The future of players that you've been around. Talking about Nene and Flower right now. These questions are kind of popping up in the chat, both for XL2 and New York XL. How do their futures look different with these two players possibly moving around? What do you think these players kind of add, having some exposure to them yourself?
I think people, I wouldn't say that people are sleeping on Nene, but I do think that Nene is, I generally do think that he's kind of on the path to potentially turn into Overwatch League's equivalent, to Faker to a certain extent. Where obviously I don't know every single player in the Overwatch League, but I think that his level of dedication is unrivaled by most of the players that I do know. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to what Nene can do as a player. Again, I can't really talk about too much because I do know some things. So it's a little bit difficult to talk about this. But yeah, I do think that Nene is going to do very, very, very well. And I think it's very difficult to overhype Nene going into the Overwatch. Flower is in a somewhat similar boat, but not quite. I feel like his World Cup performance back then has created some very, very unrealistic expectations of a lot of players. The way that the meta worked back then was that, you pretty much, the entire team supported your Widowmaker player, and the maps that you played, and the fact that it is, the World Cup. Most of the teams back then were very, very unorganized. And Widowmaker is a character that excels if the enemy team is unorganized. His organization is how you shut her down. So, he had a relatively easy time doing whatever he wanted in those matches, and, toying around with the enemy. But in organized competition that just doesn't happen, even with very, very good players. That said, he is an incredibly talented player, and his performance on XL2 does not really reflect what he is capable of, for a multitude of reasons. I can't really go into those reasons, which I guess might be disappointing for people that are watching. but some of you might know them, like, if like Reddit, has it kind of figured out already. But yeah, moving on to NYXL, I think that most of the things that were, I guess, keeping him from, I think NYXL is kind of going to unleash him to a certain. On NYXL, we're going to see what he is actually capable of, and I think that's going to paint a much more accurate picture of who he actually is as a player.
I kind of have a fairly general follow-up, I guess, to that. Eight new teams, bunch of roster shuffles, lots of players being signed from contenders, creating sort of a vacuum that is already being filled by new contenders, trials players, and everything like that. Let's just say for North America, do you think that the overall quality of games in contenders is going to take a hit because all these players just moved into the Overwatch League? Or do you think that the pool is big enough that we're still going to be okay in terms of like awesome games?
The reason it's not going to affect, I think it's barely going to affect NA contenders, mainly because a lot of NA contenders players just didn't make it into the league. The majority of new players in these expansion teams are either players that were dropped from their previous AL teams or players that are from Korean contenders. I'm pretty sure that like 70% of the new players are going to be Korean. So very few players and I can't mention any names, but a lot of the players that I have personally talked to that have been on academy teams in season 2, they are having a very, very difficult time. Like they're getting tryouts, of course, but they're having a very, very difficult time kind of getting past the I don't want to say like biases or prejudice. I think that's a very harsh accusation to make, but I think they're struggling to kind of compete with the hype that a lot of the players from different regions might have. So a lot of the faces that we saw in Contender Season 2, we will probably see them in Contender Season 3. And if we won't see them in Contender Season 3, we might not, see them at all. I know of some players that, were trying to move up into the Overwatch League, but the best thing that they could get were other academy offers. And they just decided, okay, I'm gonna throw in the towel. This isn't really worth it.
Unfortunate reality.
Yeah, gosh, that is harsh.
Anything else from you guys? Keep going.
Yeah, I don't have any. I'm trying to think of other questions. I don't really have anything right now. Trini, you have anything?
Extensive, yeah.
Yeah, this is great though, honestly.
So ioStux, before we head out, one final question. I always like to see what people's advice is to newcomers. And I know that you did mention this with Connor in your interview, but we talk about path to pro for players. Do you have any recommendations for a path to pro for prospective coaches?
I think the biggest, so coaching, or I guess moving up the coaching ladder, works very, very differently from being a good player. Mainly because okay, it's kind of hard to explain. I think the best thing you can do is work on how you present yourself. It's not just about how good of a coach you are. As a coach, you can know everything about the game. You can know every perfect strategy all of the time. But if you struggle correctly conveying that information to your team, if you struggle kind of being the father figure of the team, then having all of that knowledge is very, very useful. And I think that a lot of coaches that I personally know that are trying to make it into academy teams, and looking back on it, me before I made it into an academy team myself, we didn't really realize how much more there is to head coaching a team at that level. And just looking at the way that some of them, they act on Twitter, or the way that they talk, with other people. And if you get to see them in action, when you see them during VOD reviews or when you see them coaching their teams, you can immediately tell that it's very, I guess, amateurish to a certain degree. So I think my main recommendation is don't fall into the trap of kind of taking this a little bit too lightly. You're in the end, you're coaching a video game with other like-minded young people, so it is very easy to get into kind of a less serious atmosphere, but just try to keep it professional, try to make sure that your players respect you, and really, treat it as an actual serious profession rather than just, a fun thing on the side. And obviously you can still have fun, but if you start becoming too loose and too relaxed, it can be very, very difficult to instill confidence in your players.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay,
ioStux. Oh, God. No,
I got one more question.
Okay.
ioStux, do you celebrate Halloween? And if so, what are you going to It's tomorrow.
I unfortunately do not celebrate Halloween. If I would celebrate Halloween, I would probably just hang a huge Path to Pro shield around my chest, because that's the scariest thing I can think of right now.
Oh,
Yeah,
my
you're right.
God.
I feel that. I feel
that was a little bit harsh. It's not that bad, but
Also hilarious,
the
though.
setup was too good.
Oh,
No,
man.
that's perfect. Thank you.
No, but seriously though, thank you so much for your time and your
Yeah.
insight. I know that it really shaped the way that I'm taking some of these new news as we do move forward, and I know so many of our viewers as well really do appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
If you liked that, hit the subscribe button for more interviews and other great sports and esports content. Make sure to also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter to stay up to date on all the news from your favorite sports and esports players and teams. From our house to yours.